I almost didn't go that night. My daughter called at 4 in the afternoon, just as I was settling into my armchair with a cup of chamomile and a library book I'd been meaning to finish for 3 weeks. She said, "Mom, you have to come. It's a big deal for him. Please." And I said I'd think about it. Then I sat there for 10 minutes staring at the same paragraph, not reading a single word of it, and I thought about how many times in the last 2 years I had talked myself out of showing up somewhere because I didn't want to be in the way. So I put on my good blouse, the navy one with the small pearl buttons. I did my hair, and I went. Looking back now, I think about how different everything would have turned out if I'd just stayed home with my book. My name is Irene. I'm 67 years old. I live alone in the same house in Columbus, Ohio, where I raised my 2 children, my son and my daughter. My husband, Roger, passed away 4 years ago from a heart attack that came out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning in February. He was 62. He was fine on Monday. He was gone on Tuesday. That's the kind of thing that doesn't stop being strange no matter how long you carry it. After Roger died, I did what widows do. I kept the house. I kept his coffee mug on the shelf because I couldn't bring myself to put it away. I learned to cook for one, which is harder than it sounds. I started volunteering at the public library on Thursdays, shelving books and helping kids with the summer reading program, because silence has a way of becoming unbearable when it's permanent instead of chosen. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is and that's what matters, married a woman named Felicity about 3 years ago. I'll be honest with you, I tried. From the very beginning, I tried. I brought food when they moved into their new apartment. I offered to help with the wedding. I stayed in the background during the planning because Felicity made it clear, not rudely but clearly, that she had her own vision and didn't need input. I respected that. It's her wedding, I understood. What I didn't understand at first was that the distance wasn't just about the wedding. Felicity is a corporate attorney. She's sharp and she's driven, and she moves through a room like she knows exactly where she's going and why. I admire that about her, genuinely. What I found harder to understand was the way she looked at me sometimes. Not meanly, not obviously, just with this particular expression, like I was a problem she hadn't yet found an efficient solution for. My son adored her, that part I never doubted. He had worked for 6 years at an international trade company that did a significant amount of business with Japanese partners. He'd been working toward a senior position for almost 2 of those years, and when he finally got it, Senior Director of Asia-Pacific Relations, his company threw him a dinner. A real one. One of those private rooms in a nice restaurant downtown, the kind with cloth napkins folded into little fans and a sommelier who appears at your elbow before you've even decided you want wine. The Japanese executives were flying in from Osaka. Felicity told me about the dinner 3 days before it happened. She called, which surprised me slightly because she usually texted, and she said, "I think it would mean a lot to him if you came." She said it warmly. I want to be fair to her. She said it like she meant it. What I did not tell Felicity, what I had never told Felicity, because it had never come up, because she had never asked me very much about my life before Roger and the kids in Columbus, was that I had spent 11 years in Japan. Roger worked for a manufacturing firm in the 1980s, and for over a decade we lived outside Nagoya. My children were small. My son was in Japanese elementary school for 3 years before we came back to the States. I had Japanese neighbors, a Japanese tutor, who came twice a week because I was determined not to spend 11 years in a country and understand nothing. By the time we left, I was conversational, more than conversational. I wasn't perfect. I never was, but I could follow a dinner conversation without missing much. I could understand the things people said when they thought no one was listening. I hadn't spoken Japanese in years. But language doesn't fully leave you. It lives somewhere in the back of your mind like an old song you haven't heard in a long time. The moment it starts playing, you remember every word. The restaurant was called Haruki. It was the kind of place that felt expensive the moment you walked in, not showy, just quiet and certain of itself. My son met me at the door. He hugged me and said, "You look great, Mom," and I could tell he meant it, and something in my chest unclenched a little. There were 8 of us at the table. My son, Felicity, 2 of his American colleagues, and 3 Japanese executives, Mr. Tanaka, who was the senior partner, and 2 younger men whose names I caught but won't try to spell here. There was also an interpreter, a young woman named, well, I won't use her name. She was doing her job. She was kind. I was seated between one of my son's colleagues, a man named Brett, who talked enthusiastically about craft beer, and Mr. Tanaka, who said very little in English but smiled often and poured my water before the server could reach it, which I found lovely. The evening started well. My son was glowing. He'd worked so hard for this. I watched him talk with the executives, watched the way he leaned forward when he listened, the way he laughed at the right moments without being sycophantic. I thought Roger would have loved to see this. I thought that quietly to myself and didn't let it go further than that. Felicity was across the table from me between the two younger executives. She was doing what she did well, charming, polished, conversational. She'd clearly done her research. She mentioned a neighborhood in Osaka by name. One of the men lit up. She laughed. I watched her work and I thought, she's good at this, she really is. About an hour into dinner, after the appetizers had been cleared, there was a natural lull. Brett had excused himself. My son was showing something on his phone to Mr. Tanaka. The interpreter had stepped away briefly. And that's when I heard it. Felicity leaned slightly toward the younger of the two men beside her, the one whose English was more limited. And she said something in Japanese. She said it quietly, not whispering exactly, but with the assumption that it was a private exchange. A side conversation, the kind you have when you're confident no one at the table can follow you. I understood every word. She said in Japanese that she hoped the evening would end soon because she found it exhausting to include people who didn't contribute to the conversation. Then she said, and this is the part that made me go very still, that made me set down my water glass slowly and carefully so it wouldn't make a sound. She said that her mother-in-law meant well but was exactly the kind of woman who made these dinners more complicated than they needed to be. That she'd had to invite me because it was expected. That she hoped I would at least stay quiet. The young man glanced at me briefly, said something polite and non-committal in Japanese, and looked back at his plate. I sat with it for a moment. Just a moment. I want to be clear about what I felt. It wasn't rage. I know people expect rage when they hear stories like this. I've heard stories like this. I've watched them online where the narrator goes to pieces or storms out or delivers some devastating speech that leaves the villain speechless. That's not what I felt. What I felt was something quieter and honestly sadder than anger. It was the particular sadness of a thing you'd half suspected turning out to be true, of hoping you'd misread someone and finding out you hadn't. I took a sip of water. I smoothed the napkin in my lap. And then Mr. Tanaka, who had finished looking at my son's phone, turned to me with that courteous smile and said, in Japanese, that it was a pleasure to meet a woman who had raised such a dedicated son. I smiled back at him, and I answered him in Japanese, not loudly, not performatively. I didn't turn to Felicity and watch her face. I simply responded the way you respond when someone says something kind to you. Naturally, warmly, with a few words about how proud I was of my son and how grateful I was to be included in such an important evening. Mr. Tanaka's eyebrows rose slightly, then settled into something like delight. He said, "Your Japanese is very good." I said I was rusty, but that I had spent many years in Nagoya and had always loved the language. He said he was from Nagoya. We both laughed. The younger man next to Felicity said something to her in Japanese that I caught perfectly clearly. He said, essentially, she understands Japanese. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Mr. Tanaka and we talked, really talked, about Nagoya, about a particular ramen shop near the train station that he remembered and that I had also loved, about what the city looked like in November, about how the language had changed since the 80s. It was one of the most genuinely pleasant conversations I'd had in months, maybe longer. At some point, I was aware of Felicity's silence, which had taken on a different quality than ordinary silence. But I didn't comment on it. I didn't explain myself. I just had dinner. My son leaned across the table at one point and said, "Mom, are you speaking Japanese?" And I said, "A little. I'm out of practice." He looked at me with an expression I recognized from when he was 9 years old and I'd beaten him at chess for the first time, this wonderful mixture of surprise and respect that made me feel like myself again. Dessert was served. The evening wound down. The executives said their goodbyes with a warmth that felt genuine, and Mr. Tanaka shook my hand and said in Japanese that it was a rare pleasure. The interpreter, returning for the final exchange, caught the tail end of something and looked between us with a small smile that told me she'd understood the situation better than anyone had explained it. We gathered our things. In the lobby, while my son was helping Mr. Tanaka with his coat, Felicity came to stand beside me. She didn't say anything for a moment, neither did I. Then she said quietly, "I didn't know you spoke Japanese." I looked at her. I kept my voice easy. "You never asked," I said. She nodded once, very slightly, the way someone nods when they've just understood something they don't entirely want to have understood. My son drove me home. He was quiet at first. Then he said, "How long have you spoken Japanese, Mom?" I told him 11 years in Nagoya has a way of staying with you. He was quiet again. Then he said, I'm really sorry if she ever made you feel like you weren't welcome. I told him he hadn't done anything wrong, because he hadn't, but I also didn't tell him it was fine. Because some things aren't fine, and a woman my age has earned the right to know the difference. I got home just before 10. I changed out of my good blouse. I made myself a cup of tea and I sat in my armchair and I thought for a long time. I thought about Roger, who would have been so proud of our son tonight, and who would have squeezed my hand under the table during dinner and known exactly what was happening without being told. I missed him the way I always miss him. Not like a wound anymore, but like a room in the house that's always slightly cooler than the others. I thought about what Felicity had said. I turned it over carefully, the way you handle something fragile, trying to understand it from every angle. She was under pressure. The dinner was important. She had a lot to manage. I gave her those things. I gave her the benefit of what doubt I could find. And then I thought about being 67 years old and being someone's problem that needs to be managed. About how many times I had talked myself small so someone else wouldn't feel crowded. About all the dinners I'd almost not attended, the invitations I'd declined preemptively because I didn't want to impose, the opinions I'd kept to myself because I'd told myself they weren't needed. I thought about 11 years in a country far from home, learning its language, because I believed that if you live somewhere, you owe it to the place and to the people to understand them. I thought about the library on Thursdays and the kids who came in for the summer reading program who always seemed a little surprised that an old lady knew what books they might like. I thought about Roger's coffee mug still sitting on the shelf and how I used to wonder if keeping it there was sad, and how one day I'd realized I kept it there not because I was stuck but because I loved him and it was my house and I was allowed. I wasn't a problem to be managed. I was a woman with a history, with a language I'd learned in a city on the other side of the world, with a son I had raised mostly on my own for those 11 years because Roger worked long hours and the kids needed someone to be present, with friends who called me on Sundays and a library full of kids who waved at me when they came in, and a navy blouse with pearl buttons that I had worn to my husband's retirement dinner and my daughter's college graduation and, as it turned out, to an evening in a downtown restaurant where I had sat across from a woman who thought I wasn't worth listening to, and I had simply, quietly, without drama, without a scene, been myself. That had been enough. The week after the dinner, my son called me. He said Felicity wanted to take me to lunch, just the two of them. He said she had something she wanted to say. I said I'd come. The lunch was at a small Italian place near their apartment, the kind with checkered tablecloths and bread that arrives without being ordered. Felicity was already there when I arrived. She stood up when she saw me, which surprised me. She said, "I owe you an apology." She didn't elaborate on what she was apologizing for. She didn't know exactly how much I had understood, but she said, "I've been treating you like a footnote, and that isn't fair. You're his mother. You're important to him. I want to do better." I looked at her for a moment. She wasn't performing it. Her jaw was set the way a person's jaw gets when they're saying something that costs them something. I said, "I appreciate that. I meant it. We didn't become best friends over pasta. That's not how it works, and I'm old enough to know that." But something shifted. She asked me about Japan over the breadbasket. I told her about Nagoya, about the ramen shop, about my son's first day at a Japanese school, and how he'd come home that afternoon not crying, just very serious, and said, "Mom, it's going to take me a while to learn this." He was 6. He learned it. He's always been like that. She laughed at that story. A real laugh, not a polite one. It was a start. That's all anything ever is at the beginning. A start. My daughter called me that evening to ask how the lunch went. I told her it went fine. She said, "Fine like okay, or fine like actually fine?" I told her it was actually fine. She said, "Good. I'm glad you went to the dinner, Mom." I said I was too. I didn't tell her about the conversation I'd overheard. I didn't need to. That wasn't the point anymore. The point was this. I had almost not gone. I had almost talked myself into staying home, into making myself smaller, into deciding that my presence was more trouble than it was worth. And I had gone anyway because my daughter asked me to, and because somewhere underneath all the second-guessing I knew. I had always known that I was allowed to take up space. Roger's mug is still on the shelf. I'm not moving it. I volunteer at the library on Thursdays. The kids wave when they come in. And if anyone ever assumes in any language that I'm not paying attention, I want you to know that I probably am.